The boy was already asleep when Raymond Barnett carried him through the door. Winifred Bailey stood frozen at the kitchen table, one hand pressed flat against her chest, as if she were trying to hold her own heart inside her ribs, watching this stranger, this silent, sunburned drifter she had known for barely 3 weeks, carry her 5-year-old son across the threshold of her home, with a gentleness so devastating it nearly broke her in two. Eli's dark head rested against Raymond's shoulder, his small fist curled in the fabric of that worn canvas jacket, his cheeks flushed with the deep, trusting sleep of a child who had no idea his mother was standing 10 feet away fighting the most terrifying battle of her life. Raymond did not speak. He did not look at her. He moved through the lamplight like a man who understood that some moments required silence the way others required words, and he carried Eli down the short hallway to the bedroom, laid him on the narrow mattress, and pulled the patchwork blanket up to his chin with hands that shook only slightly at the knuckles. Then he came back and stopped in the doorway. And the secret Winifred had been carrying for 6 months, the dark, suffocating truth she had told no one, not the preacher, not the mercantile owner, not the women who brought her food when she was too exhausted to cook, sat between them in the lamplight like a loaded gun. "You know," she said. It was not a question. Raymond looked at her for a long moment. The shadows hollowed his face, and the light caught the line of his jaw and the old scar along his left temple, and he said nothing for so long that she felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "I know," he said finally. And that was when everything that had been quietly, carefully, painfully building between them for 3 weeks came undone at the seams and fell apart and began, terrifyingly, to reassemble itself into something neither of them had expected, and neither of them knew how to survive. But none of that was where the story truly started. It started 6 months earlier, in the raw, hungry spring of 1882, in a town called Red Rock Flats, New Mexico Territory, where the land was the color of an old wound, and the wind blew in from the desert with enough grit in it to scour the paint off a barn door. Winifred Bailey had been a widow for 11 months when the letter arrived. She remembered the exact weight of it in her hand, heavier than it looked, the way bad news always was. It had come from a law office in Santa Fe, addressed in a tight, formal script that told her immediately it was not from a friend. She stood on the porch of the house her husband Thomas had built with his own hands before the fever took him, holding Eli on her hip because he was too small still to be trusted near the porch edge, and she read the letter 3 times before she understood what it was saying. Thomas had borrowed money. Not a little. A great deal of money, borrowed from a man named Harlan Stroud, who operated out of Santa Fe and whose name she had heard in the way that people mention a storm on the horizon, quietly, carefully, with their eyes cut toward the door. The debt had come due 90 days after Thomas's death. Winifred had not known about the debt. She had not known about Harlan Stroud. She had not known about a great many things, and that ignorance, which had felt like the ordinary privacy of a working marriage, now felt like a trap she had been living inside without knowing the walls were closing. The letter informed her in the measured language of men who had done this many times, that if the sum of $412 was not paid in full within 60 days, the property, the house, the barn, the 40 acres Thomas had worked until the soil knew his name would be forfeit. $412. She had 17. Eli tugged at her braid. He said, "Mama, your face looks funny." "Does it?" she said. "Like when the bread burns." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and told him they were going to go see about the chickens. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the bed that still smelled faintly of Thomas, even after all these months, cedar and iron and the particular warmth of him. And she stared at the ceiling, and she ran the numbers through her head the way a person runs their tongue over a broken tooth, again and again, hoping to find an angle that didn't hurt. There was no angle. She had her garden and her eggs and the small income she made taking in mending for the Calloway sisters, and none of it added to anything like $412 in 60 days. By morning, she had made a decision that she told herself was practical and not desperate, though it was both. She would take in a boarder. The house had a second room that Thomas had built intending it to be for more children, the children they had not yet gotten around to having when the fever arrived. It was small and smelled of cedar and dry adobe, and it looked out over the desert where the light turned the color of burning copper at sunset. She nailed a notice to the board outside the mercantile owned by a stout, good-natured man named Clarence Pitts, and she wrote it in her clearest hand: room and meals available. Widow's household. Respectable only. She did not expect much. Redrock Flats was not a place that attracted a great many respectable people. She was right in that assessment, as it turned out. The first 3 men who came to inquire were a drunk former cavalry scout who smelled of something she could not identify and did not want to, a traveling patent medicine salesman whose eyes tracked the room with the greedy attention of someone making an inventory, and a young cattle hand who was perfectly pleasant but who told her earnestly that he would not be able to pay for the first 2 months because he was saving up. She thanked them all and sent them away. On the 22nd day of April, 1882, Raymond Barnett rode into Redrock Flats on a bay horse that had seen better years, with a bedroll tied behind the saddle and a rifle in the scabbard, and not much else that she could see. She did not notice him at first. She was at the mercantile collecting a spool of thread and arguing politely with Clarence Pitts about whether calico had gone up in price again when the bell above the door sounded, and she turned automatically. He was tall in the way that men who have spent years on horseback are tall, all economy and no waste, like a thing that has been refined down to its essential structure. His hat was battered, and his jacket was the color of dried grass, and there was a quality about him that she registered before she had words for it, a quality of stillness, as if he moved through the world without disturbing it. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 older, with dark hair and the kind of weathered face that the territory printed on men who spent their lives under an open sky. He glanced at her notice on the board, and then at her, and then away, and something in the sequence of those glances struck her as different from the others. Less calculation, more thought. He bought a box of rifle cartridges and a tin of tobacco he didn't open, and he was halfway to the door when he stopped and half-turned and said, without quite looking at her, "Is the room still available?" She said, "It is." A pause. "I can pay in advance 6 weeks." She looked at him carefully. "Cash money?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied his face for another moment and found no specific danger in it, which was not the same as safety but was, in her current situation, close enough. "You can come look at the room," she said. "I make the final decision." He nodded once and followed her out of the mercantile and down the packed dirt street to the house at the edge of town, and she showed him the room and watched his face as he looked at it, the narrow cot, the single window with its view of the desert, the cedar smell, and his face did not change at all, which she decided to interpret as acceptance rather than disappointment. "There are rules," she said. "I figured. No drinking on the property. No guests after dark. Supper is at 6 and I do not hold it. Breakfast is at 7. You earn your own washing, but I'll provide the tub and the soap. My son is 5 years old and you will speak to him with respect or you will leave." She said that last part with a specific weight because it was the one she meant most. Raymond Barnett looked at her then, a direct look she had not quite expected, steady and without challenge in it, just a kind of clear attention. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "All of that is fine." She charged him $4 a week, which was more than the room was worth and less than she needed, and he paid her 6 weeks in advance without flinching, and she counted the coins on the kitchen table with Eli watching from the doorway with enormous solemn eyes, and when she put the coins in the tin box where she kept her money she felt, for the first time in 11 months, like she might possibly survive. She told herself that was the only thing she felt. She was not entirely honest with herself. The first week was careful and quiet. Raymond kept to himself with a discipline that felt practiced rather than natural, like a man who had learned containment, the way another man might learn a trade. He was up before she was, which surprised her, and she would find him already at the well when she went out in the mornings, drawing water without being asked, setting the full buckets by the kitchen door, gone before she could thank him. He ate what she put in front of him without comment and cleared his own plate, and Eli watched him the entire time with the unself-conscious fascination of a small child who had not yet learned to hide his interest. On the fourth day, Eli said at breakfast, "Are you a cowboy?" Raymond looked at him across the table. "I have been," he said. "What else have you been?" "Lots of things." Eli considered this. "What are you now?" Raymond looked down at his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment in a way that Winifred did not know how to read. "I'm not sure yet," he said. Eli seemed to find this a deeply satisfying answer. He nodded gravely as if it confirmed something he had suspected and went back to his biscuit. Winifred poured her own coffee and did not look up, but she had heard every word, and something about the honesty of it, the unguarded quality of it, stayed with her through the whole of that day. She had been afraid, in a way she had not admitted even to herself, that a man in her house would feel like a danger. Thomas had never been a danger. Thomas had been gentle and steady in hers, but his absence had taught her how unprotected the world was, how thin the wall between safety and ruin, and she had half expected that a strange man moving through her house would feel like a threat she was tolerating for money. Instead, Raymond Barnett felt like a kind of weather she had not accounted for. Not threatening, not safe in any simple way either, just present, and his presence had a texture she kept brushing against when she wasn't paying attention. She noticed the way he repaired the loose step on the porch on the fifth day without mentioning it. She noticed the way he lifted Eli up to see over the fence when Eli was trying desperately to get a look at a hawk sitting on the far post, and then set him back down without making a production of it. She noticed the particular way he had of being useful without making her feel obligated, which was a skill she did not think most men possessed. She noticed too much. She knew she was noticing too much. She told herself it was only because she was unaccustomed to adult company, and the loneliness of the past 11 months had made her oversensitive to human presence, the way a person who has been in darkness sees shapes in the dimmest light. On the 9th day she came home from the Calloway sisters' house with Eli asleep across her shoulder. He had worn himself out chasing their barn cats, and she was struggling with the door because her hands were full and she was trying not to wake him, and Raymond appeared behind her so quietly she nearly came out of her skin. He said, very low, "I'll take him." She almost said no. It rose to her lips automatically, the refusal, the instinct to manage alone. But Eli was heavy and her arms ached, and Raymond was already holding out his hands, and she found herself transferring the sleeping weight of her son without entirely deciding to. He carried Eli through the door and down the hall and laid him on his mattress and pulled the blanket up, and she stood in the hallway and watched and felt something shift in her chest, like furniture being moved in a room she had thought was locked. He came back and looked at her in the dimness of the hallway, and she had the sudden irrational feeling that he could see everything, all of it, the debt and the fear and the loneliness and the specific grief of missing Thomas and the confusing, unwanted awareness she felt whenever Raymond was near, and she wanted badly to say something dismissive and sharp to put distance between them. What she said instead was, "Thank you." He said, "Of course," and went to his room, and she stood in the hallway for another moment and pressed both hands over her face and breathed until she felt like herself again. She was not entirely successful. The second week brought trouble, the kind that had been sitting on the horizon since the letter arrived and was now making its unhurried way closer. 2 men came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon, well-dressed by Redrock Flat standards, which was not very well-dressed at all but meant they had the money to aspire to it. One was a lawyer named Foster. The other did not introduce himself, and she did not ask. They sat in her kitchen, and Foster placed a document on the table and told her, with the rehearsed sympathy of a man who felt none, that Harlan Stroud was prepared to offer an extension on the debt in exchange for a lien on the property, meaning that he would own the house and land, but she could continue to live in it as a tenant at his sufferance. At his sufferance, she repeated. It's a generous offer, Mrs. Bailey. She thought about what it would mean. To live in her husband's house as a tenant of the man whose money had contributed to her husband's ruin, because that was what she was beginning to understand, that the money Thomas had borrowed had come with conditions that had strangled him even before the fever found him, conditions he had not been able to tell her about because telling her would have meant admitting the full shape of the trap he had walked into. "No," she said. Foster blinked. "Mrs. Bailey, no, thank you, gentlemen." The man who had not introduced himself looked at her for a long, flat moment before he stood. He had pale eyes and a quality of unhurried menace that she recognized from the same instinct that made rabbits freeze in open fields. He put his hat on and said nothing and followed Foster to the door. And when they had gone, she sat at her kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed until the shaking stopped. She did not hear Raymond come in from the barn. He had been fixing a loose board on the door frame that had been bothering her for weeks, but she heard the particular quiet of him in the kitchen doorway and looked up. He said, "Trouble." "Nothing I can't manage," she said, which was the sort of thing people said when they couldn't manage it at all but weren't ready to admit it yet. He looked at her for a moment and then crossed to the stove and poured water from the kettle into the tin mug she kept on the shelf and set it in front of her and sat down across the table and waited. He did not ask again. He just waited, and the patience of it was so different from what she expected that she found herself talking before she had decided to, the words coming out in a low, careful stream, the shape of the debt and the letter and the 60 days and the $17, and all the while he listened without moving and without changing expression. And when she was done, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "How much do you still need?" She shook her head. "It's not your concern. I'm asking." She looked at him. $370, roughly, by the 15th of June. He nodded slowly, as if he were calculating something behind his eyes. "I may know of some work in the area." "Legitimate work," he added, and something in the way he said it told her that he knew she would have asked. She said, "I appreciate the thought," and meant it and hated how much she meant it, because gratitude was a door and she was trying very hard to keep all the doors between them closed. The third week was when the doors started coming off their hinges. It happened gradually and then all at once, the way the territory's spring rains worked, a long, dry patience, and then suddenly everything at once. It started with small things. Eli, who had never easily warmed to strangers, and who had spent 11 months in the particular solemnity of a child, who has absorbed an adult grief too large for him, began following Raymond around with the devoted concentration of a person who has found something worth following. Raymond did not encourage it in any obvious way, but he did not discourage it either, and she would watch from the kitchen window as Raymond did small tasks around the property and Eli trotted alongside asking a steady stream of questions that Raymond answered in his unhurried, even way. "Why does the wood split like that?" "Grain of it. Wood has a direction like anything else. You work with it, it splits clean. You fight it, you're wasting time." "Do people have grain?" A pause. "Some do." "Do I?" Another pause. "You've got it. You're young enough to choose which way it goes." She heard that from the kitchen window and had to sit down. She told herself the tightness in her chest was concern. The concern of a mother observing her fatherless child forming an attachment to a man who would, by the nature of who he was, eventually leave. Drifters left. That was what the word meant. She knew this. She told herself she knew this. She also told herself that she was not attracted to Raymond Barnett. She told herself this while noticing the way he moved, while noticing his hands careful and large and permanently marked by work, while noticing the quality of his attention when he looked at her, which was different from how most men looked at women, and she could not precisely name the difference except that it felt like being seen rather than being assessed. She told herself a great many things that stopped working at roughly the midpoint of the third week. He had brought her firewood in just 2 armloads, stacked beside the kitchen stove without comment, and she had been standing at the counter cutting potatoes, and she turned to say thank you, and he was closer than she had realized, reaching past her to set a piece of wood in the box. And for a moment they were near enough that she could see the scar at his temple clearly, and the way the afternoon light caught the angle of his jaw, and she could feel the warmth of him in the small kitchen, and the world became very specific and very quiet. Neither of them moved for a moment. He stepped back. "Sorry," he said, and his voice was slightly different, lower and less even, and that difference told her things she did not want to know. "No," she said, "don't be." He looked at her, she looked back. Something passed between them that had no name yet but had a weight and a direction, and she felt it land somewhere behind her sternum and stay there. He said, "Winifred," the first time he had used her name. Just that, just her name, and then nothing else. She turned back to the potatoes. "Supper in an hour," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, and she was absurdly proud of that. He went out. She stood at the counter and did not move for almost a full minute. That evening over supper, Eli told Raymond with enormous seriousness that he was his best friend in Redrock Flats, which produced a silence at the table that she felt all the way down to her bones. Raymond looked at Eli and his face did something complicated, and then he said with the same careful evenness, "That means a lot to me, Eli." "You could stay," Eli said. "Forever. Mama has the extra room." "Eli," she said, "I'm just saying." She met Raymond's eyes across the table and looked away first. After Eli was in bed, she sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the desert night, which was full of the small sounds of living things going about their nocturnal business, and she tried to think clearly about the situation. There was a debt. The debt was the reality. Everything else was the kind of feeling that a lonely woman developed when a decent man was kind to her and her son, and she needed to keep those two categories very firmly separated. The porch door opened and Raymond came out and sat on the step below her, not close but not far, and they sat in the dark together in a silence that felt, disconcertingly, like a conversation. After a long time she said, "You said you knew of work." "I do. Donahue's ranch about 12 miles east. They're looking for hands through the summer. The foreman is a man I know, fair wages." "And you're considering it?" A pause. "I'm considering staying in the area if that's acceptable." She absorbed that. "Why?" she asked, and meant it as a direct question about his reasons, which she recognized was forward and possibly unfair, and she asked it anyway. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I haven't had a reason to stay anywhere in a while. I forgot what it felt like." She did not ask him what he meant by a reason. She already knew, and the knowing was terrifying, and she held it at a careful distance. "The room is yours as long as you need it," she said. "Thank you," he said. They sat in the dark for another hour, not speaking much, and it was the most comfortable she had felt in longer than she could clearly remember, and that fact alone was more frightening than the debt. She went inside before she did something irreversible. The next morning was when she found out that Harlan Stroud was not a man who accepted the word no from a widow in a small town. Clarence Pitts caught her at the well, his wide face creased with something she did not immediately identify as worry, because Clarence Pitts was not a man given to visible worry. He told her, in a low, fast voice, that the man with the pale eyes who had come with Foster, his name was Deke Connors, and he was Stroud's man. The particular kind of man that men like Stroud employed because they were willing to do things that other men would not, had been asking around town about her situation, about whether she had anyone to help her. "He's asking whether you're alone," Clarence said plainly. "That's the gist of it." She felt the familiar cold settle over her, the cold that had come with the first letter and not really left. "He's making sure there's no one who would cause a problem," she said. "That's how I read it." Clarence looked at her carefully. "The Bailey property is valuable, Winifred, more valuable than the debt by a long way. Stroud isn't just trying to collect. He wants the land." She had suspected this. Hearing it stated plainly made her stomach drop anyway. "How long do I have before this becomes something other than a legal matter?" Clarence was quiet for a moment. "I'd say you have until he runs out of patience with legal channels. So, not forever." She thanked him and went home and stood in her kitchen trying to think. And what she was thinking about was not just the debt and the land, but the fact that Eli was 5 years old and had already lost his father, and she was not going to let him lose his home too, and that she had 15 days left before the debt came due, and she was still nearly $300 short. Raymond came in for breakfast, and she told him everything. Not because she had planned to, not because she had decided it was his business, but because the words came out and she let them. All of it. Harlan Stroud and Deke Connors and the land and the timeline and Clarence's warning. He listened the way he always listened, without moving, without the small, anxious sounds people made when they were preparing their response instead of actually listening. When she was done, he said, "Deke Connors." The way he said the name was different, flat and specific. She looked at him carefully. "You know him." A pause that answered her before he did. "I know of him," Raymond said. "By reputation, he's not a man who stops." "I know," she said. "I need to know what my options are." "Your options," Raymond said, and there was something careful in the way he arranged those words, "depend on what you're willing to do." He looked at her steadily. "I took that job at Donahue's ranch. I start tomorrow. Between my wages and what I've already paid you, we might be able to close the gap by the 15th. It's possible." She stared at him. "Raymond, I'm not offering charity," he said before she could say it. "I'm offering a loan. At whatever terms you think are fair, you can pay me back when you're able." She wanted to refuse. Every independent instinct she possessed rose up in protest. Every habit of self-sufficiency she had built over 11 months of managing alone. And she opened her mouth to say no, and what came out instead was, "Why?" He met her eyes. The morning light was coming through the east window, and it caught him fully, and she could see his face clearly, all the careful steadiness of it, and underneath that the thing that he was not saying but that was there regardless. "You know why," he said quietly. The kitchen was very still. "I can't," she started. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I'm not asking for anything at all. I just don't want to stand by and watch something unfair happen to you and Eli when I have the ability to help." He held her gaze. "That's all it is, Winifred." She did not believe that was entirely all it was. She also believed it was what he meant, and she was beginning to understand that Raymond Barnett was a man who meant what he said with a precision that most people never managed. She sat down at the kitchen table. She picked up her coffee cup. She said, "I will pay you back, every cent." "I know," he said simply, and that was the end of the negotiation. He went to work at Donahue's ranch the next day, coming back every evening in time for supper, his jacket dusted with the particular reddish dirt of the eastern range. And Eli would greet him at the porch with the joyful certainty of a child who has decided something is permanent. And Winifred would watch from the kitchen doorway and feel the frightening warmth of it, and tell herself to be careful, and then set one more place at the table. The trouble with Deke Connors came on the last Thursday in May. She had sent Eli to Clarence's to help Mrs. Pitts, a mild fiction because Mrs. Pitts did not particularly need help from a 5-year-old but had agreed to the arrangement when Winifred asked, because Clarence had told his wife the whole of the situation, and Mrs. Pitts was the kind of woman who understood what it meant to keep a child out of the path of something dangerous. Deke Connors came to her door in the early afternoon, alone this time, without the pretense of a lawyer. He stood on her porch and looked at her with those pale, unhurried eyes and told her that Mr. Stroud's patience was a finite resource and that the offer of the lien arrangement was being withdrawn in favor of the original terms, which meant that if she did not have $412 in full by the 15th of June, she would vacate the property. "And if I don't vacate," she said. He smiled. It did not improve his face. "You will," he said. "One way or another, Mrs. Bailey." She stood in her doorway and held his gaze and did not let herself look away because she knew looking away would matter to a man like this, would be read as a piece of information about how hard she could be pushed, and she was not going to give him that. "The debt will be paid," she said, "in full. On the 15th. Something flickered in his pale eyes. "Is that so?" "That is so." He looked at her for a long moment and she held very still. Then he put his hat back on and nodded once and left, and she watched him go down the street and around the corner, and then she went inside and sat on the kitchen floor because her legs had given up without warning. And she sat there on the packed clay floor with her back against the cabinet and her hands in her lap, and she breathed for a very long time. Raymond found her like that when he came in that evening, not on the floor anymore. She had gathered herself after a few minutes and resumed functioning, but still slightly pale and slightly too quiet. He saw it immediately. She did not know how he read her so accurately when she had not told him anything yet, but he had a quality of attention that caught things most people missed, the small variations in a person's expression and posture that were not quite invisible if you were watching with real care. He said what happened. She told him about Connors's visit. She told him with a steadiness she was genuinely proud of, watching his face as she did and noting the way his jaw set and the particular stillness that came over him when he was processing something dangerous. When she finished, he said, "How much time do we have left?" 18 days. He did the arithmetic in his head. "I'll ask Donahue about additional hours. There's also a cattle drive passing through next week. I heard in town they're looking for extra hands for the push north. 3 days' work, good pay." "Raymond, you're already Winifred." He said her name and she stopped. He did that occasionally, used her name as a way of cutting through the thing she was about to say, and every time it worked, which told her something about him she was still in the process of understanding. "I'm fine. I want to do this." A pause. "Let me do this." She looked at him across the kitchen in the yellow afternoon light, and she thought about what it meant to let someone help you, what it cost in pride and what it built in something else. And she thought about Eli on the porch calling Raymond his best friend, and she thought about the night on the porch in the dark that had felt like a conversation. "All right," she said. He nodded and went to wash up, and she turned to the stove and smiled at the wall where he couldn't see her. The 2 weeks that followed were the most complicated of Winifred Bailey's life, which was saying something given the past 11 months. Raymond worked double hours at Donahue's ranch and took the 3-day cattle push job and came back from it looking like a man who had been physically tested to his limits and was satisfied with the results. He gave her every dollar he earned, keeping back only what he needed for tobacco and the occasional cup of coffee at the saloon, and she kept track of every cent in her careful bookkeeping with the intention of repaying him exactly, not a dollar short. And she told him so, and he said that was fine and meant it. Meanwhile, the thing between them that had no name grew larger and less manageable. It was in the small moments, always the small moments. Him handing her a cup of coffee in the morning with the particular attention. He paid to the exact right amount of sugar because he had observed her preference without her telling him. Her bringing his jacket in off the line when the evening turned cold without thinking about it, just doing it automatically, folding it over the chair by his door. Eli sitting between them at supper, telling long, complicated stories about his day with the comfortable certainty of a child who knows he has 2 people's full attention. She began, in those 2 weeks, to understand the specific nature of what she felt, which she had been calling attraction and awareness and other manageable words. She understood it one evening when Eli had a nightmare and woke crying, and she went to him, and Raymond appeared in the doorway of Eli's room with a lamp, because he had heard and come instinctively. And he stood there in the doorway while she soothed Eli, just present, just steady. And when Eli had gone back to sleep, Raymond looked at her across the dim room, and she understood that what she felt was not just attraction. She was falling in love with this man, and had been since approximately the 2nd week and possibly earlier. The recognition landed with a specific quality, not quite joy, not quite terror, but a mixture of both, the way the desert felt right before a storm when the air changed and everything became very particular and charged. She was terrified, not of him, of what it meant. Of Eli's attachment and her own vulnerability, and the fact that drifters left, that was still true, that remained true regardless of how many firewood armloads and repaired porch steps and cattle drive wages were placed between them. He had not said he was staying. He had said he was considering it. Consideration was not a promise. She had learned in 11 months what the absence of a person felt like, and she was not sure she could learn it again. She did not tell him any of this. She told herself she was waiting to see whether the debt was resolved before introducing any other complications, which was a practical position, and also a cowardice she was fully aware of. The debt was resolved on the 12th of June, 3 days before the deadline. She counted the money at the kitchen table: Raymond's wages, her own savings, 3 weeks of extra mending income, money borrowed from Clarence Pitts at a fair rate that she would repay in eggs and mending over the coming months, and it came to $417 and some cents. She counted it twice. She looked up at Raymond, who was sitting across the table watching her count. "It's enough," she said. He exhaled slowly. Just once, just a small controlled release of breath, but she saw it, and it told her how much he had been carrying. The next morning she rode to the lawyer's office in the nearest substantial town, Carlisle, which was 14 miles east of Redrock Flats, and she paid the debt in full and received a receipt and a release document in return, and rode home with both of them tucked inside her dress, because she was not letting that paper out of her immediate reach for anything. She got home to find Eli and Raymond in the yard with a piece of rope and some kind of complicated project involving the fence post and a stick, which Eli explained at great length, and which she understood to be some sort of trap for ground squirrels, which she was fairly confident would not work, but was not going to discourage because Eli was laughing with his whole body, and Raymond was looking at him with an expression she did not have words for. Fond and careful, and something else underneath that she needed to not think about too directly. She went inside and put the receipt in the tin box and sat down and felt, for the first time in 6 months, something close to safe. Then she sat with that feeling and thought about what came next. That evening after Eli was in bed, she told Raymond that the debt was cleared. He was on the porch and she sat beside him in the chair she had taken to thinking of as hers, which was another thing she noticed without acting on. "Good," he said. "I need to start paying you back," she said. "There's no rush." Raymond. She used his name the way he used hers as a way of cutting through. "I mean to pay you back, but I also—" She stopped, started again. "I want to talk to you about something else." He turned to look at her. The porch was lit by the single lantern she had brought out, and it made the light warm and uncertain, and she was grateful for the uncertainty because it made what she was about to say slightly less exposed. "I don't know what your plans are," she said carefully. "After this summer, after the room," she gestured vaguely. "I don't know what you intended when you came to Redrock Flats. I don't know if you were passing through or if—" She stopped again. He was watching her steadily. He did not help her. "I want you to know," she said, "that whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm grateful, not just for the money. For the—" She gestured again, a gesture that encompassed the yard and Eli's laughter and the firewood and the porch in the dark. "All of it." "Winifred," he said very quietly. "I'm also not going to pretend," she said, because she was too tired for pretending and too far past that point anyway, "that this has only been a financial arrangement. From my side, I'm not going to pretend that." She looked down at her hands. "But I know that you might not, that you might have your own reasons for things, and I don't want to assume—" "Winifred." She looked up. He was looking at her with a directness that made the lamplight feel irrelevant, a directness she had seen in flashes over the past 3 weeks, but never quite this unguarded. And he said, "I haven't stayed in one place in 6 years. I moved from town to town because I didn't have any reason not to, because everywhere felt the same." A pause. "It doesn't feel the same here." She held very still. "I don't know what I have to offer you," he said. "I have my horse and my wages and the kind of past that takes some explaining." He held her gaze. "I'm willing to explain it if you want to hear it." She thought about what it meant for a man like Raymond Barnett to say that, a man for whom words were not casual currency, who used them with the care of someone who understood their weight. Offering to explain his past was, she understood, a significant offering. "I want to hear it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark desert. The night insects were doing their work, and somewhere far off a coyote made its presence known. "I was a lawman," he said. deputy sheriff over in Tucson 8 years ago, then a marshal's deputy in 2 other territories. I was good at it. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it she was listening for. There was a man I was after years back. Bad man, smuggling operation wanted in 3 territories. I got close to catching him and he a pause. He involved my family as leverage. I had a younger brother, 19 years old. My brother got hurt badly enough that he never fully recovered. The words were measured and she could hear the cost of each one. The man I was after, I caught him eventually. But what happened to my brother? I couldn't go back to the work after that. The idea of being responsible for other people's safety when I hadn't been able to keep my own brother safe, I couldn't hold those 2 things at the same time. She was quiet, listening. So I left, drifted. Took work where I found it, nothing that required staying anywhere. That's been my life for 6 years. He looked at her then. I'm 31 years old and I have been moving so long I forgot what it felt like to stop. She thought about the weight of that. 6 years of deliberate impermanence, the kind of life you built when grief had convinced you that staying was a form of risk you could not afford. How is your brother now? She asked. Something shifted in his face. Better. He married a good woman in Tucson, has 2 kids. He recovered more than I expected, honestly. A quiet exhale. He wrote to me last year, said I should stop running from something that had already ended. Smart man, she said softly. The corner of his mouth moved. He always was. She looked at him for a long moment in the warm, uncertain lamplight. Raymond, she said, I'm a widow with a 5-year-old son and a house with a leaky roof in a small town in the territory, and I have no idea what the next 5 years look like, and I am honestly terrified a significant portion of the time. That's what I am. She held his gaze. I'm also very sure of how I feel about you. In case that's relevant to whatever you're trying to decide. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, with a quietness that had more weight in it than most men could put into a shout, it's very relevant. She breathed out. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, not grabbing it, not urgently, just taking her hand with both of his and holding it. And she felt the warmth of it and the calluses of his palm and the steadiness that was just his nature, the particular bedrock quality of him. They sat on the porch holding hands in the dark for a long time, and the desert night moved around them, and Winifred Bailey felt, for the first time since Thomas died, like the future was something she could look at directly. But she had not yet told him her secret. The dark, heavy truth she had been carrying since before Raymond arrived, the thing that had made her hands shake when Connors came to the door, the thing she had protected with silence, because she had not known who she could trust with it and had not been willing to risk getting it wrong. She had not told him that she had a witness. The summer Thomas died, he had not been alone in those final days. He had spoken, feverish and half delirious, to a man who had come to the house, a former business partner named Cal Maddox, who had been with Thomas when he originally borrowed from Stroud and who knew, in full, the terms of that debt and the way Stroud had structured it specifically to ensure default. Maddox had come to the house to say goodbye to Thomas, and in doing so had told Winifred things she had been turning over ever since, things that suggested Stroud's claim was not entirely clean, that there were aspects of the original contract that would not survive a proper legal examination. She had kept Maddox's name and words to herself because she had not known what to do with them, had not had the money for a real lawyer, and because Stroud was the kind of man whose reach extended in ways she could not fully see, and she had been afraid of what he would do to Maddox if she made noise about it. Now that the debt was paid and the paper was in her tin box, the urgency had dropped to something manageable. But she had still been carrying it, and Raymond had said he knew, that night when he came back carrying Eli, and she had been waiting for the other shoe to drop. She told him all of it on the porch that night once they had been holding hands long enough that the territory between them had changed its nature, the whole thing. Maddox and what Thomas had told her and what Maddox had confirmed and what it meant about Stroud and why she had not told anyone. Raymond listened. When she was done, he said, "Maddox, is he still in the area?" "I believe so. He has a small ranch about 30 miles north. He should talk to a proper lawyer. Not someone Stroud has in his pocket, a real one, in Santa Fe or Albuquerque. What you're describing might be grounds to pursue Stroud for a fraudulent debt scheme. You might not be the only person he's done this to." She had thought about this. She had thought about it a great deal. "I was afraid to act on it alone," she said honestly. "You don't have to act on it alone," he said, and the simplicity of that statement, 4 words in his steady voice, moved through her like water through dry ground. "No," she said, "I don't." They sat a while longer, and then he brought her hand up and held it against his jaw for a moment, the roughness of his beard against her knuckles, and she was so undone by the tenderness of the gesture that she had to look away at the desert to keep herself composed. He said, very quietly, "I'm staying, Winifred, if that's what you want." She looked back at him. "It's what I want," she said. And that was that. The decision made in the dark on a porch in Red Rock Flats, New Mexico Territory, in the summer of 1882, between a widow who had been afraid for a long time and a drifter who had been running for longer, and both of them arriving at stillness at the same moment in the same place. The following weeks had the quality of something that was both new and entirely familiar, which she would later think was how the right things often felt. Not like finding something you had never seen before, but like coming back to a version of yourself you had almost forgotten was possible. Raymond went to Donahue's ranch each morning and came back each evening, and the house had the particular warmth of a place where multiple people are invested in it, where there are 3 coffee cups in the morning instead of 2, where the sound of someone else moving around in the early light is not alarming but comforting. He and Eli developed their own vocabulary, the specific shorthand of a person and a small child who have decided to belong to each other without anyone making a formal announcement about it. Eli showed Raymond where the best horned toads lived in the garden wall. Raymond showed Eli how to whistle, which occupied them both for an entire Saturday afternoon, Eli's attempts producing sounds that made the chickens scatter with apparent concern. They played checkers on the porch with the beaten-up set Thomas had made from bottle caps, and Raymond let Eli win the first game and then did not let him win the second one, which Eli respected more than the deliberate loss. She watched them and let herself feel it. She had been so careful for so long, so controlled in what she permitted herself to feel and show, and she was learning slowly that the control had been a survival strategy and not a permanent condition. Raymond said nothing more about the future for several weeks, which she did not take as withdrawal. She was coming to understand that he was a man who decided things completely before he spoke about them, who let the decision settle fully before bringing it out into the air. So when he spoke it had weight, and when he was quiet it was thinking, not retreat. On a Sunday in late July, the day after he had come back from a trip to Carlisle where he had spoken with a lawyer on her behalf about the Stroud situation, he sat down across from her at the kitchen table after breakfast while Eli was outside with the dog he had adopted from Mrs. Pitt's litter, a big-eared brown thing Eli had named Sergeant. He said, "The lawyer in Carlisle thinks there's a real case to be made against Stroud based on what you told me about Maddox's account of the original contract. He wants to speak to Maddox directly. I gave him Maddox's name and location." "Good," she said. She meant it deeply. Not just for herself, but for all the other people she knew existed somewhere in Stroud's orbit who did not have a Raymond Barnett to drive 14 miles to a lawyer on their behalf. "He thinks it will take some months," Raymond said. "It might not result in anything. Stroud has money and connections." "I know," she said. "But at least the attempt is being made." He nodded. Then he was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands on the table. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "I want to know if you consider marrying me." The kitchen was very still. Through the window she could see Eli and Sergeant engaged in some elaborate game that involved a great deal of running. "Raymond," she said carefully. "I know I don't have much," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite uncertainty but was close to it, a vulnerability she had not heard from him before. "I have some savings and a job and a horse and some particular skills with fence posts." The last words had a dry quality that made her want to smile even as her heart was doing something entirely undignified. "I know it's been a short time. I know you've had a hard year. I know you don't owe me anything." He raised his eyes to hers. "But I mean to stay here for the rest of my life if you'll have me, and I'd rather do it properly." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter in the tin box and the night on the porch and the way he carried Eli and the specific patience of the way he listened, and all the small evidences of his character she had been accumulating over these weeks like someone who knows they are building something significant and is trying to do it right. "Yes," she said, "I would consider it. I would very much consider it." He looked at her and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen from him, a warmth so direct and undefended that it was almost hard to look at, the way some lights were. "Yes to considering," he said, "or yes to yes." She laughed genuinely out loud, which startled them both slightly because she had not laughed like that in quite some time. "Yes to yes," she said. "You absolutely infuriating steady man." He reached across the table and took her hand again the same way he had on the porch, and she turned her hand over and held his, and he said, "I'll do right by you, Winifred, and Eli, that's a promise I mean." "I know," she said. "I've been watching you do it for 2 months. I'm fairly convinced." They were married in September, a small ceremony at the church in Redrock Flats with Clarence and Mrs. Pitts as witnesses and Eli standing beside them with the grave, ceremonial air of a child who understands that what is happening is important even if he is not entirely clear on all the details. He was wearing a shirt Mrs. Pitts had ironed that morning, and his hair was flat, and he was holding a small bunch of desert wildflowers he had collected himself, which he presented to Winifred at the conclusion of the ceremony, with the manner of someone completing an important official function. She took the flowers and bent down and kissed his forehead, and he bore this with 5-year-old dignity. Raymond shook Clarence's hand and thanked him, and Mrs. Pitts pressed her hand to Raymond's face the way older women sometimes did with men they had decided deserved blessing, and Raymond bore this with 31-year-old dignity, which was not entirely different from Eli's. They walked home together, the three of them, Eli between them holding a hand of each, and the New Mexico September light was the color of something beautiful, and Winifred kept the wildflowers and put them in a glass of water on the kitchen table where they stayed until they were beyond staying. The months that followed were the ones she would think of later, when she was old and trying to explain what a life was made of, as the months when the shape of things became clear. Not that nothing hard happened, things that were hard happened, because they always did. The winter of 1882 brought a cold that was unusual for the territory, and they had 3 weeks where the pipes froze and Eli had a cough that frightened her before it resolved on its own, and the Stroud legal matter moved with the glacial pace of frontier justice, which was no kind of fast. But inside the hard things there was something new, the particular strength of being hard things together rather than alone. When Eli's cough kept her up at 3 in the morning, Raymond was awake too, not told to be, just awake, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight with tea and the specific patience of a man who had decided that whatever was required of him, he would provide it. When the pipes froze, he and Clarence spent 2 days fixing them without complaint, coming in each evening stamping snow from their boots and drinking the coffee she had ready. She paid Raymond back every dollar of what he had given toward the debt carefully over those months, and the day she handed him the last of it she said, "We're even." He took the money and said, "You know that was never the point." "I know," she said. "But it was the point to me. I needed it to be." He nodded, understanding because he understood that kind of thing, the importance of not carrying obligation as a permanent weight. She had watched him over these months and understood that he had his own version of it, the obligation he still felt toward his brother, which he carried carefully and visited once in person in January, coming back from Tucson with a slightly different quality about him, a settling that she recognized as a man who has made peace with something. "How is he?" she asked when he came back. "Good," Raymond said. "He's good. He has a son now, born last November." A pause. "He's named him Thomas." Something in the timing of that made her breath catch just briefly. "That's a good name," she said. "He said he thought so." Raymond looked at her. "He wants to meet you, eventually, when it's easy for you to travel." "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. The Stroud matter was resolved the following spring, in April of 1883, in a way that was not as satisfying as she had hoped and more satisfying than she had expected, which was how legal matters usually went. The lawyer in Carlisle, assisted by testimony from Cal Maddox, built a case that demonstrated Stroud's fraudulent structuring of debts in the territory, and while Stroud was not criminally prosecuted, his money was sufficient to prevent that. There was a civil judgment against him that required restitution to several debtors, including a return to Winifred of roughly $90 in improperly applied fees on Thomas's debt. It was not justice in the full sense she would have preferred. But Stroud's operation in the territory was effectively ended, and Maddox told her, when she ran into him in Carlisle during the proceedings, that 3 other families had been helped by the judgment, which was the part she held on to. She used the $90 to fix the roof properly. Raymond watched her direct the carpenter's work from the yard with Eli on his shoulders, and his expression was the kind that she had learned to read over these months as his version of happiness, which was not loud but was thorough. On a warm evening in May of 1883, nearly a year after Raymond Barnett had first walked into Clarence Pitt's mercantile and noticed her notice on the board, she told him that she was expecting a baby. They were on the porch, inevitably, because the porch was where they went to be alone together, the nights after Eli was asleep, the settled darkness of it. He was still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her fully, and she could see, even in the dim lamplight, that the expression on his face was one she did not have words for, a joy so thorough it had surprised him. "Winifred," he said, and said nothing else for a moment. "I know," she said. She stopped and started again. "I'm happy," she said. "I'm very happy and a little scared." "Me too," he said. "Both things." He reached out and put his hand against her face, careful and warm, and she leaned into it. "Both things at the same time." "I think that's probably right," she said. "I think that's what it's supposed to feel like." She was right, as it happened. Their son was born in January of 1884, during a cold that was no more forgiving than the previous winters, delivered by the midwife and attended by Raymond, who was present for the whole of it because Winifred had asked him to stay, and he had not considered for a single moment not doing so. He was a dark-haired, loud, furiously healthy boy that they named Daniel, which was Raymond's father's name, and Eli met his brother with the seriousness of someone who has been waiting a long time for someone to be serious with. "He's very small," Eli said, studying Daniel with the concentration of an expert. "He'll grow," Raymond said beside him. "What does he eat?" "Milk right now, like a calf, more or less." Eli considered this at length. "I'll teach him about the grain in wood," he said finally. Raymond looked at Winifred over Eli's head, and she was so full of everything she could barely breathe. "That's a good plan," Raymond said. The years settled around them like land being built rather than time passing, each one adding something solid. Raymond established himself at Donohue's ranch with the kind of reputation that came from being reliable and honest and extraordinarily competent. And by 1885, Donohue had made him foreman, a position that came with a wage that made the financial terror of Winifred's recent past feel like a different world. She continued her mending work because she had come to understand that she enjoyed having work that was hers, and expanded it into something that resembled a modest dressmaking service, which the women of Red Rock Flats were grateful for. Eli turned 8 and then 9, and continued his education in the particular school that Raymond provided, which ran parallel to the actual school on the other side of town, and was composed of things like woodcraft and animal care, and the principle that you worked with the grain of things rather than against them. And alongside the formal schooling produced a child of unusual steadiness and curiosity, who the teacher told Winifred was the best reader in his class, and the only one who had tried to explain to her the structural properties of different wood types. Daniel grew, as Raymond had promised, and showed every sign of being constitutionally incapable of sitting still for more than 4 minutes, which was a new experience for everyone in the household, and which Raymond met with the patience that was simply his nature. Daniel said his first word at 11 months, which was not mama or papa, but dog, directed at Sergeant, who had by then attained the elderly distinction of a dog who had been part of a family long enough to be treated like a full member of it. In the spring of 1886, she told Raymond she thought they might be expecting again, and this time he laughed, which was a sound she had come to love the way she loved specific landscape features, her particular joy and nobody else's. 3, he said. Unless it's twins, she said. He stopped laughing and stared at her. Is it? I have no idea, she said, but your face was excellent. He pulled her to him and she went, leaning her forehead against his chest the way she had learned to do in the years of this marriage, the specific geography of him that she knew now as well as she knew the land around Raydrock Flats. Whatever it is, he said into her hair. Whatever it is, she agreed. It was one baby, a girl, born that November, healthy and fierce in the way that some babies arrived already having opinions about things. They named her Margaret, after Winifred's mother, and Eli and Daniel received her with the particular attitudes of their individual natures. Eli with careful, serious interest, and Daniel with the delighted certainty that she had been produced specifically for him to be excessively fond of. Winifred lay in bed the evening after Margaret's birth and Raymond sat beside her, and she was tired down to the marrow and also so entirely full of gratitude and love and the specific rightness of her life that she did not have words for it. She said, "Raymond." He said, he was looking at Margaret, who was asleep against Winifred's chest. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" "The notice I put on the board at Clarence's," she said. "Room and meals, respectable only." She felt him shake slightly with the quiet laugh he did sometimes when something genuinely pleased him. "I was so afraid of letting anyone in, I almost didn't put it up at all." "I know," he said. "You looked at me like I might be a problem." "You were a problem," she said. "Just not the kind I expected." He turned to look at her and she looked back, and in the lamplight and the evening quiet with Margaret sleeping between them, she thought that this was what love actually looked like. Not the first recognition of it, not the terrifying fall of it, but this years of it, the built and daily thing, the wood grain of a life that had found its direction and gone with it. "The best kind of problem," she said. "I hope so," he said, and kissed her forehead, and the desert night outside the window of Thomas Bailey's house. Raymond Barnett's house now, theirs, fully and legally and in every sense that mattered, went about its ancient business, and inside the lamp burned low and the children slept. It was the following summer, 1887, when Raymond's brother James came with his wife Clara and their 2 children to visit, making the journey from Tucson on the train to Albuquerque and then by wagon, because the railroad had not yet reached Raydrock Flats and perhaps never would, and Winifred stood on the porch with Margaret on her hip and watched the wagon come up the road and felt the particular warmth of something she had been looking forward to. James Barnett was nothing like Raymond to look at, shorter and broader and with a livelier face, the kind of man who talked with his hands, but he had his brother's quality of genuine attention, and she liked him immediately and completely. Clara was a small, quick woman with iron-colored hair and a frank manner that Winifred appreciated, and they sat at the kitchen table while the men were outside with the children, and they drank coffee, and Winifred told her about the letter and the debt and the notice on the board, and Clara listened with the engaged concentration of a person who understood what it was to have had the floor taken out from under you and to have found solid ground again. James talks about Raymond the way you talk about something you're proud of, Clara said. Even during the years when they were estranged, he was always proud of him. He should be, Winifred said. He is now especially. Clara looked at her directly. Whatever you did letting him stop it mattered. You can see it in him. Winifred thought about that. She had not thought of it as something she had done. It had not felt like an action but a mutuality, two people deciding at the same time to stop moving, to let the ground be solid. I think he was ready, she said. I just happened to be a reason that came at the right time. Don't undersell yourself, Clara said, with the manner of a woman who has given this advice before and expects it to be taken. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Raymond explaining something to Eli and James's older boy, both of whom were paying the intense attention of children who have recognized expertise. Daniel was sitting in the dirt near Sargent with the contentment of a child who has found his preferred territory. The afternoon light was the color it got in July, deep and almost violent in its brightness, and the yard looked like something from a painting of the life she had wanted before she knew she wanted it. She poured Clara more coffee and Margaret pulled at her braid, the same gesture Eli had made on the porch 5 years ago when she was reading the letter that had started everything, and she thought about how much had changed, and how all the changes had gone in a direction she had not predicted from that porch, could not have predicted from that porch, and she was glad of that she had not been able to see it, that it had arrived the way it did. One careful, steady man in a battered hat who noticed her notice on a board and asked about the room in a voice that had no performance in it. James and Clara stayed for 2 weeks, and when they left there was the particular cheerful grief of a good visit ending, and the understanding that they would see each other again, and the country between them was not so impossible. James took Raymond aside before they left, and she did not hear what was said, but she saw her husband's face when he came back in, and it was the face of a man who has had a weight removed from him that he had been so accustomed to carrying that he no longer noticed it. His brother had forgiven him, she understood, for the years of distance, for the running, for the guilt he had carried since the night his brother was hurt. Or perhaps forgiven was the wrong word. Perhaps confirmed that there was nothing to forgive. Either way, the weight was gone. "All right," she said when he came in. "Yes," he said, and meant it in the full sense. "Yes, I'm good." She put her hand on his face and he closed his eyes for a moment. "Good," she said. "We have dinner to make and Daniel has gotten into the garden again." He laughed and went to deal with Daniel, and she watched him go with the particular fullness she felt whenever she observed him in motion in their life. This man who had carried her sleeping son inside and pulled the blanket up without saying a word. This quiet, steady, careful man who had turned out to be exactly what was needed. The summer of 1888 brought a drought that the territory had not seen in some years, and with it, the particular anxiety of people who depend on land and water. Donahue's ranch managed it because Raymond ran the operation with the foresight that had been his hallmark as foreman. He had seen the signs of a dry year coming and had made arrangements months earlier for water access, and the cattle losses at Donahue's were the lowest in the county. People noticed. People talked. Several neighboring ranchers came to him for advice, which he gave without making them feel small for needing it. Winifred's garden suffered, and she replanted it more carefully, choosing the species that could manage the heat, and she went out in the evenings with the children to water it and taught them all, even Margaret at nearly 2, what she was doing and why. The teaching felt important to her. The knowledge of how to manage, how to work with the conditions you had rather than the conditions you wished for. She had learned that from the worst period of her life, and she wanted her children to have it without having to learn it the hard way. In the fall of that drought year, a man came through Red Rock Flats with news that Harlan Stroud had died in Santa Fe, apparently of a heart ailment, and that his various business interests were being wound up by his creditors. The news came to Winifred secondhand through Clarence Pitts, who told her at the mercantile with the particular care of a man delivering information he thinks might have some emotional charge. She stood for a moment with a bolt of calico in her hands and thought about Harlan Stroud. She thought about what his greed had cost Thomas and what it had cost her, and the 11 months alone with Eli in the house, with the debt sitting over her like a ceiling coming down. She thought about the other families, the ones the civil judgment had helped and the ones it hadn't reached. She said, "Thank you, Clarence." She did not feel joy at the news. She did not feel grief either. She felt something more like the closing of a parenthesis, the end of a sentence that had been left open for too long. She went home and told Raymond, and he listened and nodded and said, "It's done, then," and she said, "Yes," and they left it there because there was nothing more useful to say about it. Eli turned 12 that year with the specific dignity of a boy who has decided he is nearly grown. He was tall for his age and had Thomas's coloring and Raymond's quality of attention, and the combination was striking in a child. He was the best student in his school and intended to be a doctor, a decision he had made at 11 after Mrs. Pitts had a difficult winter and Eli had spent significant time watching the doctor from Carlisle work, asking questions the doctor had answered with surprised patience because they were good questions. "A doctor," Raymond said, when Eli announced this. "Yes," Eli said. "There's no doctor in Redrock Flats. There should be." Raymond looked at Winifred over Eli's head. She raised her eyebrows. He turned back to Eli. "That's a good reason," he said. "I know," Eli said. Winifred put her hand over her mouth so he would not see her smile. Daniel at 4 was a force of nature that no fence could entirely contain, which kept Raymond occupied in ways that she observed from a distance with a combination of sympathy and entertainment. He was full of joy, her younger son, in the way that some people simply were, constitutionally, the joy of fact about them like their height or their hair color. Margaret had discovered language with the enthusiasm of an explorer, producing words and then sentences, and then, by her second birthday, complex arguments, which Daniel found deeply annoying and Eli found fascinating. Their house had expanded in 1887, a new room added on the east side by Raymond and Clarence and a couple of men from the ranch, built on a Saturday with a quantity of coffee and a cheerful competition about who could put up a wall fastest. The house was not large by the standards of people with money, but it was thoroughly theirs, every board of it known, every window placed where it was for a reason. On a November evening in 1889, with the first real cold of the season settled over the territory, Winifred sat at the kitchen table doing her accounts. The dressmaking had grown into something that took a proper ledger now, and Raymond was across from her mending a harness by the lamplight, and the children were asleep, and the house was quiet with the specific warmth of a place that has a fire in it and people who intend to stay. She looked up from the ledger and looked at him and thought about the night she had found him in the kitchen doorway, steady and watchful, when she was explaining to him what she had been reading in a letter she had not wanted to receive. She thought about the notice on the board at Clarence's and about the way he had asked about the room, that careful sideways attention that had been so different from calculation. She thought about the first time he carried Eli, the way his hands had been, the way he had pulled the blanket up without a word. He looked up from the harness and caught her looking. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was thinking." "About what?" She considered this. "About how much has happened in 7 years," she said. "How much has changed?" He set down the harness and looked at her. "Good changes or bad? All of the above," she said and smiled. "Mostly good, overwhelmingly good." He looked at her for a moment. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said, and she recognized the callback and it warmed her. "What?" she said. "The notice on the board," he said. "Respectable only." The corner of his mouth moved. "I almost didn't ask about the room." She looked at him. "Why didn't you? You looked at me like you were deciding whether I was trouble." "I was," she said. "I decided you weren't." "You were right," he said. "I usually am," she said. He laughed, the real laugh she loved, low and genuine, and she felt it the way she always did in the specific center of her. "Winifred," he said after the laugh, with the warmth in his voice that she had been hearing for 7 years and never gotten used to and did not want to get used to because she had decided it was better to feel it fully every time. "Raymond," she said back. He picked up the harness again and she went back to her ledger, and the fire burned, and the wind moved outside over the desert, and all 3 of their children slept in the rooms of their house. And outside the territory went on being what it was, enormous and demanding, and sometimes cruel, and sometimes so beautiful it made your chest hurt. And inside the lamp burned and the accounts balanced, and the harness was mended, and the floor was solid, and the walls were sound, and the 2 people at the table had found in each other and in this small town, and in the life they had built from the pieces of the hardest year either of them had ever known, something that many people spent whole lives searching for without finding. They had found something worth stopping for. The years continued as years do, carrying gifts and griefs in equal measure, but the foundation did not shift. By 1892, Eli was studying medicine in Albuquerque with the help of a modest scholarship from the territorial government, corresponding with his mother twice a month in letters that grew increasingly technical and that she kept in a box on the shelf. Daniel, at 8, had developed an obsession with horses that Raymond recognized and carefully cultivated, spending Saturday mornings at the corral teaching him, with the same patient attention he had once given to explaining wood grain to a 5-year-old. Margaret was 5 and ruled her corner of the world with a cheerful, benevolent autocracy that made everyone around her slightly unsure how they had ended up agreeing to everything she suggested. And in the autumn of 1893, when Winifred was 36 and Raymond was 42, and they had been married 11 years and had built something that was both ordinary and extraordinary in the way that all good lives were, she told him she thought they might be having another baby. He was in the yard. She came to the porch and said it, and he turned around and looked at her, and he was so clearly, unreservedly happy that she had to sit on the porch step because her legs were unreliable. "Another one," he said. "Don't sound so surprised," she said. "We have not exactly been deterring this outcome." He crossed the yard and sat beside her on the step, and she put her head on his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the afternoon was the color of everything she had ever wanted. "A 4th one," he said. She said, "What do you think?" She thought about it with honest attention. She was 36, and the territory was still the territory, and money was better but not abundant, and Margaret was only 5, and Daniel was 8, and her dressmaking had just expanded to take in a young woman assistant named Pearl who was learning fast. She thought about all of that with the clear-eyed practicality that had always been her strongest characteristic. "I think," she said, "that the house is full already and will get fuller, and that I would not trade a single thing about it." He pressed his mouth against her hair. "No," he said. "Neither would I." Their 4th child arrived in May of 1894, another boy, pink and furious and loud, who they named William, and who Daniel greeted with the delighted certainty that this one was his, and Margaret greeted with the proprietary interest of someone who has decided on a project. Eli came home from Albuquerque for the summer that year, and sat with the baby with the specific attention of a young man who had been learning medicine for 2 years, and was applying this knowledge to his infant brother, with a thoroughness that Raymond observed with dry amusement, and Winifred observed with the particular pride of a mother, who has watched this child grow from the small, grave-faced boy in the doorway to a young man of 20 who knew things and cared about knowing them. "He's healthy," Eli announced, completing his informal assessment. "Thank you, Dr. Bailey," Raymond said. "Barnett," Eli said, without looking up, and Winifred's heart did the undignified thing it did whenever she was reminded that Eli had taken Raymond's name, quietly, on his own initiative, when he was 14, and that Raymond had been unable to speak for several minutes when he was informed of this. "Barnett," Raymond agreed, and looked at his coffee cup, and she saw his jaw work once with the particular control of a man keeping a strong feeling contained. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. Eli was still studying William with professional interest. Daniel was outside with Sergeant II, the son of Sergeant I who had lived to an impressive age and departed the previous winter. Margaret was constructing something elaborate with blocks in the corner that had been explained at length to everyone, but understood by no one. Outside, the territory went about its business, and inside the house was full of noise and warmth, and the particular sacred, ordinary quality of a family that knows itself and knows it is full. And Raymond Barnett held his wife's hand at the kitchen table of the house that had once been a trap and was now unambiguously a home, and they were both exactly where they had chosen to be. "Happy," she said. He looked at her, the same look she had been receiving for 11 years, steady and warm and completely without pretense. "Happy doesn't cover it," he said. She smiled. "No," she said, "it never quite did." And outside, the September light of 1894 lay over Redrock Flats like a benediction, and the desert was the color of everything that endures. And inside, the lamp was already lit against the coming evening, and all 4 children were alive and loud and present. And the woman who had once put a notice on a board that said respectable only sat at her kitchen table, holding the hand of the man who had answered it, and the life they had built together. From the dark past and the hidden secrets and the forced choices and the dark motive of one greedy man and the absolute opposite of all that in the quiet soul of a drifter who was no longer drifting, sat around them on all sides, solid and real and theirs. The rest of the night came on gently, the way good things did, and they let it come.